Hello, welcome to this webinar, Quantifying Your Cyber Risk, Measuring What Matters. I'm Simon Marvel. I'm the CEO and founder of Acuity Risk Management. I'm joined by my colleague, Richard Mail, who's Director responsible for Technology and Services.
Hello from me as well.
We'd like to make this session interactive, so please feel free to add your questions into the chat box as we go, and we'll leave time to answer them at the end. If you'd like to contact us directly via email or LinkedIn, our details are on the screen here. We're going to share the slides and the recording in the coming days, so you'll have our details if you want to reach out to us at a later date. Also, when we close, or when you close the session and leave the webinar, a survey will pop up. We'd be very grateful if you could answer that, to give us your feedback, to let us know the subjects that you'll be interested in for future events. This is the third in an executive series of webinars. The first was 2 weeks ago. It was Cyber Ready, 7 Steps to Building a Risk-Based Approach to Cybersecurity. That's available on demand on our website for those of you that didn't see it. And 2 weeks from today, we're running the third webinar titled Risk and the Board, Convincing the Board of Your Cyber Risk Approach is the Most Important Thing You Do. And that's at the same time on Tuesday, June the 2nd. The agenda for today then, I'm just going to start with a little bit of background and then talk about why we should be measuring cyber risk in financial terms. Talk about measuring what matters and use a couple of examples. Richard is going to then talk about some practical experiences with implementing risk quantification and the risk-based approach to cybersecurity. We'll introduce a supporting resource that goes with this webinar at the end, and also allow time for questions and answers, as we've already said. So just by way of background, I think it's useful just to outline what good looks like as far as cybersecurity is concerned, and this is our experience in dealing with our customers and talking to executives, in that they're looking for resilience to loss events. Everybody knows that we can't avoid data breaches, but we want to try and make sure that they're tolerable and that we're resilient to them, and we certainly want to avoid cyber catastrophe. We want to make sure that our resources are used effectively and efficiently when they're targeted at the risks that could cause the greatest harm. We want spending to be optimized, so we're getting value for money from it. We want investment, or the need for investment, to be understood and to be justified. Gartner are now predicting annual spend on cybersecurity products and services up $170 billion a year by 2022. So business leaders are rightly looking to see that they're getting value for money for that investment, and that it's contributing in the right sort of way to the business overall. We want to contribute to strategic decisions, particularly as businesses move more and more towards digitization going forward. They want to understand the risk implications, the cyber risk implications related to those decisions. So we want to be able to contribute to that. And overall, we're seeking confidence that our cyber risk is under control. I just wanted to highlight 2 points that came out of the previous webinar. Firstly, and I referred in the previous webinar to some research produced by McKinsey, the management consultancy, towards the end of 2019. And they'd identified that the majority of organizations these days are taking a maturity-based approach to cybersecurity, which is focused on building security capabilities. And that, they identified, suffers from 3 quite significant problems. First of all, that it can result in unmanageable growth in control and governance. And as a result, spending escalates because we try to control everything. And also related to that, then we get implementation gridlock, because the limited high skill resources that we have that are able to implement cybersecurity get overwhelmed. So they predicted the next stage on the cybersecurity journey is to move towards the risk-based approach, and they've identified a number of companies that are already embracing this. And the risk-based approach is focusing on reducing enterprise risk. So focused on risk reduction, aligning our cybersecurity programs with the board's targets, optimizing our defenses around resilience, risk reduction, and targeted at critical assets, and overall reducing costs while improving security for our most critical assets. And I think everybody would agree that if we can do that in current times, then that's certainly something that we should be looking to achieve. The second point really that I wanted to bring forward from the previous webinar was just the fact that cyber risk is continuous. It isn't a one-off project type risk that you can identify, measure, treat and close, nor is it a risk that you can look at once a year and update, because things are changing all the time. Our business outcomes are delivered via critical business processes which depend upon sensitive and critical information assets and other supporting assets, and things change all the time. So new threats materialize, vulnerabilities are identified, incidents occur, control weaknesses emerge, perhaps from audits or from penetration tests or other activities. All of these have the effect of increasing our risk profile. Below the line, we can take action to remediate critical vulnerabilities. Threats might reduce of their own accord, of course, or we might remediate audit findings. We might implement new technology and services to improve our cybersecurity. Okay, so over time, our risk changes, and if we can measure risk, and if we can compare our risk status with our tolerance for risk, then we may find that sometimes we're below tolerance, other times we go above tolerance, and so on. And we also talked in the previous webinar that going above risk tolerance can be a good leading indicator to problems further down the line in terms of unbudgeted expenditure and ultimately deterioration in business outcomes as a result of incidents and breaches that may occur. So in order to be able to have this sort of visibility of our risk status and to make risk-based decisions, then we need to be able to measure risk. And so just moving on, the dollar is, or the euro, or the yen, or the pound, whichever currency is the universal language of business. It's understood by everybody. Whichever currency you operate in, it's translatable throughout the world. It's a hard measure of success or failure, even in the public sector, where there might not be the same profit motive, but there's still a cost focus on the delivery of public services. It's the basis of planning, forecasting, and investment decisions. So it applies equally to cyber risk and cyber security as it does to any other aspect of business or any other enterprise risk. Reputational and other subjective impacts manifest eventually as financial impacts. A good example could be the Wells Fargo mis-selling scandal, which I think started in 2014. It was a very significant reputational scandal for Wells Fargo Bank in the US. And as a result of that, the loan book slumped. They struggled to attract new customers in subsequent years. Deposits, revenue, and profits all declined. So there was substantial financial impact on the business in the following years. And then finally, we increasingly these days understand the financial impact of cybersecurity breaches. There's a lot of research that's done and published, and this is just a simple example from one of those reports. The Ponemon Institute in 2019 produced a report on costs of data breaches, and I've just taken this slide from there. They found that in the 2019 report, the average cost globally of cyber breaches, data breaches, was just under $4 million. And there were 4 main contributors to those costs. So lost business, which accounted for about 36%, post-breach costs, notification costs to regulators and to affected individuals, and detection and escalation costs. They also identified some variation by industry sector, ranging from the highest costs being in the health, financial services and energy sectors down to public sector at the bottom. Also in the report, they drew a correlation between the number of records that were lost in data breaches and the cost of those data breaches. And I think that accounts for the fact that public sector are down at the bottom here, because apart from health and education, they probably hold less personally identifiable information than some of these other sectors. In terms of assessing risk and understanding risk, at the very broadest level, it's a combination of the cost of a breach and how many times it's going to happen a year. So if, for example, we have malware attack and on average they cost $50,000 each and they happen 10 times a year, we're going to lose $500,000 in a year. But of course, there's uncertainty in the cost of a data breach. And we found from experience and practice that the distribution, the probability distribution of the cost of a data breach looks something like this. There's a most likely cost from a breach, but there's also a probability or a possibility that it could be less. And there's a small possibility or probability that it could be very much higher. Now, if we had lots of data, historical data within our organization of similar breaches in the past, we could perhaps plot this type of distribution, but many organizations don't have that. But in 2015, the Institute of Risk Management surveyed financial sector, so banks and insurance companies, and they found that 73% of organizations that they surveyed use this type of distribution. It's referred to a log normal distribution for modeling the cost of operational risks. And this is borne out in practice and what we're seeing with cyber risks as well. So there's a distribution to our potential financial loss from a cyber breach. Similarly, there's uncertainty in the frequency of a data breach. So we might think that on average in the next year we'll have 10 malware incidents, for example, but there could be fewer and there could be more. And again, the same survey showed that 86% of respondents use a Poisson distribution, which is this type of distribution for modeling the frequency of operational risks. So this is a way of reflecting uncertainty in both the cost and the frequency of cyber breaches. And we can then combine these two distributions together to calculate a risk profile, so a financial loss profile. So if we combine the cost profile with our frequency profile, then we can get this sort of output. This is called a loss succeedance profile, and it's giving us the probability that we're going to lose a certain amount of money in the next 12 months. And again, the same survey found that 78% used Monte Carlo simulation, so statistical analysis, to model the financial loss profile based on these two distributions. So as an example of this is a loss succeedance curve. This is a way in which we can visualize financial risk. This is showing the probability of a loss in the next 12 months exceeding these values across the bottom. So we're saying that there's roughly an 83% chance that we could lose more than $1 million in the next 12 months. Coming down, there's a 30% chance that we could lose more than $3 million. This is a logarithmic scale here. Or a 10% chance that we could lose more than $5 million in the next 12 months. So it's quite a nice way of visualizing risk. And we can also overlay onto this our tolerance for risk. So this could be management's tolerance for risk. And here we're saying that management only have a 25%, only prepared to tolerate a 25% chance of losing more than $1 million in the next 12 months, or a 7.5% chance of losing 3 million, or a 5% chance of losing 5 million. So this is a nice visual representation of our financial loss profile compared to our tolerance for risk. And if we want to be resilient to risk, bearing in mind that we think that being and operating above risk tolerance is a leading indicator for future problems, then we need to try to get this loss profile to move down towards our tolerance for risk. Okay. Now, this type of analysis can be done at the individual risk level, or it can equally well apply to aggregating risk. So this is an example where we've aggregated a number of risks in a number of countries. So we have a loss exceedance distribution for France, for the UK, for Germany, for Italy, and an aggregate view for Europe overall, which is the black line on the outside. And we can then compare that with the risk tolerance that we've set for Europe. So again, we can see that there's a gap here. Up until now, most organizations that have assessed cyber risk traditionally have used a qualitative type assessment approach. So using very low to very high rating for impact and likelihood, and plotting that on a heat map, the red, amber, green heat map, for example. So we see that quite frequently. It's very difficult to aggregate risks in any meaningful fashion from a red, amber, green heat map. And if you're not measuring in financial terms, then it's even more difficult to create a financial profile as a result of that. And it's also very difficult to compare your risk status with your risk tolerance. Okay, so the financial approach allows us, and statistical analysis allows us to generate this type of visualization of our risk status. So I can hear you then asking, okay, so in practice, how do we go about undertaking a quantitative risk assessment? Well, there are actually just 4 important data points. If we can understand the lower bound and the upper bound of our potential losses with a confidence interval, that gives us all the data we need to know to understand the distribution of this cost profile. So if we're to say that we think that the cost of ransomware attack, I think I saw today someone quoting that the potential cost of a ransomware attack was about 70 million. So let's say that we think the cost was between 40 and 100 million, for example, with a 90% probability. So in 90% of the cases, if we have a ransomware attack breach, we think the cost could be between 40 million and 90 or 100 million dollars. Then that's sufficient information to allow us to understand this distribution. So there are 3 data points there. The 4th data point then is on the frequency profile. If we understand the most likely frequency of a data breach, then that gives us enough to be able to understand the frequency distribution. And then if we apply Monte Carlo analysis, we can generate this loss exceedance profile. So compared to a qualitative approach to cyber risk assessment, where we're looking at 2 data points, a qualitative assessment of likelihood and impact, we're instead looking at 4 data points. And that's all we need to do to give us a reasonable assessment of our financial loss profile. In terms of the data sources that can help us to establish our potential cost profile and frequency profile, we can use both trailing indicators and leading indicators. So trailing indicators could be history of incidents and near misses and other industry data. That's going to help us to understand potential losses and potential frequency of events occurring. Similarly, leading indicators like threat intelligence, vulnerabilities that we identify, the status of controls arising from audits and tests, and so on. Input from subject matter experts, and also scenario analysis and test results are all sources of data that can help us to understand the potential cost profile and the potential frequency profile, and in particular, these 4 data points. So that's how we can assess and we can visualize a financial loss profile from cyber risk. So how do we go about now reducing risk? If our risk is above tolerance, then what are we going to do about it? And the main lever for reducing risk is through applying controls. And I'm talking about controls in their widest sense here. So it could be typical technical controls like multi-factor authentication or encryption. It could be education and awareness. It could be patching critical vulnerabilities more quickly. It could be building resilience into our business processes. It could be implementing business continuity plans. All of these have the effect of reducing risk. And there are two other factors that are important in relation to controls, and that's the strength of the control at resisting threats and the effectiveness of the implementation or the deployment of the control. So for example, high-grade encryption is a high-strength control protecting against loss or theft or interception of data, but only if it's effectively deployed end-to-end. If there are gaps in the chain, then we're still at risk. We're still at higher risk. Similarly with education and awareness, that is effective, and that can be a relatively strong control at mitigating phishing type attacks, but only if it's deployed across all of your employees. If there are some that aren't trained, then you have some weakness and potential higher risk. Okay, so understanding the strength of control and the effectiveness of their deployment are two important factors as well. I'd just like to look at a couple of examples now in practice. So this is an example looking at a proposal to address a problem that we're having within our fictitious organization, which relates to data leakage. And we're seeing data leakage of a number of sensitive data assets, customer data, employee data, research data, via various channels, mobile, cloud, email, and so on, across different countries within Europe. Now, one potential solution to that is to deploy an enterprise DLP solution, which can address data leakage or help to address data leakage via multiple channels. And we've identified that that would cost $500,000 a year to deploy, and we've assessed the data leakage risks and aggregated them, and we found out that we believe we've got a 40% chance of losing more than $10 million in the next 12 months from data leakage. Now, we've also modeled enterprise DLP. We're going to assume that if we implement it, we're going to implement it effectively in the way in which it should be deployed, but we need to estimate the strength of that control. And there are a number of ways that we can do that. We could run a pilot project, for example, and measure before and after effects of a DLP pilot. We could seek input from subject matter experts. For example, I wouldn't ask the vendor of the DLP solution personally. And we can also statistically model the effect of the strength of the control as well. So whatever approach we take, we can model the effect of implementing this new control. And that's what we're showing here with this blue curve. And here, down here, we're showing now that the probability of losing more than $10 million is less than 5%. So the question that we're now left with is, should we spend $500,000 a year on enterprise DLP to reduce the risk of losing $10 million in the next year from 40% to less than 5%? And I think this is a mature conversation that you can have with budget holders and with the board. It's based on some financial analysis and some statistical analysis. It's reflecting uncertainty still. Even if we spend $500,000, there's still a residual risk of less than 5% that we could lose $10 million in the next year. But it's a realistic set of information on which to have a discussion with budget holders. You'll notice over here we have a green line, and this is because we have other controls already implemented that we're tracking, but which aren't fully effective in their implementation. at the moment. And so we can also forecast what might happen if we take action to improve those other controls that we already have in place. And we can see that if we do that, we're actually going to get our risk profile down quite close to our tolerance for risk. So on a related note, but coming at it from a slightly different angle, this is another example looking at Chicago in our fictitious organization. And there we have a number of key controls, standard configuration, patch management, privileged access management, and anti-malware, which we've assessed and we've measured either through some sort of ongoing performance measurement and metrics, or perhaps as a result of an audit. But we found that the implementation, the effectiveness of these controls is poor. And we've rated these, we've assessed them, ranked them on a scale of 0 to 100%. And you can see here we've highlighted those that are particularly weak in their implementation. But they're key controls, they're helping us to mitigate some key controls within Chicago banking. And what we've done is that we can flip the view round and look at it from a controls-based perspective and say that if we were to take action to improve the implementation of these controls so that they're fully deployed and fully effective, what do we think that would do to the financial risk profile? What's our estimate of the risk delta, the risk improvement that we could achieve if we took this action? And you can see the figures here in the risk delta column for each of these, and we've sorted them in descending order of risk delta. Now again, this is statistical. This is showing the most likely risk delta, but of course it could be higher and it could be lower, and so we need to be conscious of that, and we could analyze further if we need to. Okay, but if we have limited budget and we need to know where to prioritize our expenditure on security programs, then from a risk delta perspective, it's these two, standard configuration and patch management. Of course, we can also record the cost of our security improvement programs, and this is simply another sort on the same data, which is showing the risk delta as a proportion of the cost of the security program. And here we've got a slightly different order in terms of our priority for addressing these security programs. And we can also look at it from a risk-based perspective. So we're taking the two, standard configuration and patch management, and we're remodeling the financial risk profile here. And here we can see that we're actually getting quite close just by improving standard configurations and patch management. That's going to get us quite close to our risk tolerance. And then if we were to address the other two security programs, then we can see from this green line, the potential risk is going to take us beneath our risk tolerance. So a couple of examples there, one coming at it from the point of view of justifying investment in new security products and services, and the second one in terms of prioritizing our security improvement programs where we have limited budget. And I think at that point, I'm going to hand over to Richard and ask him to talk about some of his practical experiences.
Thanks, Simon. So for this slide on practical implementation, I'd like to share a glimpse of some of the issues that we might typically encounter when we first start working with a new customer to help them improve the way they deliver their risk management using our Stream platform. So the first area I want to highlight here is that if the customer's current approach is more sort of controls maturity based rather than truly risk based, then typically there'd be something of a lack of focus on the most significant risks to the business, whereas of course you would want to be focusing on the highest priority risks. Typically the various risk management activities might not be sufficiently continuous. For example, with risks being revisited, say, once a year, perhaps just before an audit, which is quite often the case, or even that risks and mitigating controls might only be revisited as a reaction after some sort of incident or breach. And of course, it's rather late by then. So clearly it would be better for higher priority risks to be revisited more often. if we're working with an organization that's looking to implement a risk management platform to replace manual ways of working, then typically we'd find that the various risk-related data is sort of scattered between often quite a very large number of separate spreadsheets and other documents. You might have risk registers, lists of your key assets, key applications, incidents, control assessments, vulnerabilities, all sorts of actions, threat catalogs, all separate and not correlated. And again, when we first start working with a customer, the chances are they would typically have been using some sort of simple qualitative method for assessing their risks, such as a 5x5 heat map, as Simon mentioned, and perhaps for historic reasons, or just to allow information security risks to be reported upwards into a corporate level of reporting. And the final point, which is quite often what we see, and a point worth making, is that we'll often find that an organization's existing risk registers actually contain a lot of items that are not really risks, rather things like incidents, actions, and control weaknesses, to name a few. And it's only when we start looking at assessing risks more quantitatively, it quickly then becomes clear if a defined risk is actually not a risk at all. So the other thing I want to say is that we don't recommend simply switching from a qualitative to a quantitative risk assessment approach just by itself. In order to really get the maximum benefit from risk management, we recommend that this change needs to take place within an overall structured approach. And now in our previous webinar in this series, we introduced a 7-step approach. I'd just like to revisit those steps now with a few more examples based on our experience working with real organizations. Note also that these steps are already consistent with what you should be doing to embrace compliance with standards such as 27001, i.e. sound scoping, maintaining good evidence, operating clear plan, do, check, act type processes, with a view to achieving continuous improvement. So that first step was to set the right scope, and so this is about us wanting to focus on our priority risks. Now, the previous webinar mentioned that we might want to use a triage type of step to focus on our key risks before we decide which risks we actually want to assess in detail, perhaps using a quantitative approach. So an example of this might be a lot of our customers focus on their key applications. So they've got a list of all their applications, and what you can do is a quick assessment, a quick triage assessment to decide which of those applications you want to look at in more detail. So you might have a set of simple questions, such as, is there external access to the application? How many users will use it? Does it connect with other applications from third parties? And, and what is the most sensitive category of data that the application processes? So you might have 10 questions like that, and then you get certain points for each answer, and then look at the total amount of points, and that will then give you an indication of whether that's an application that needs more detailed, perhaps quantitative risk assessment. And our customers use that kind of triage quite commonly for applications, but also for business processes, for looking at their third parties, for looking at different sites. So that's a good technique. Also, it's important to know where your most critical data is located. So, i.e., which data is associated with which of your applications, systems, networks, physical environments, etc. So knowing that, and that's all about scoping, we can then focus better on looking at the risks to those supporting assets, the ones that that contain the most sensitive data. Okay, so the second point was about correlating information, really, and it's important to bring together all of the various risk-related data that you have. So, for example, when an incident occurs, obviously we don't want that, but when it happens, ideally, you should be able to link that incident to the risk in a register that you should have been tracking. If you get an incident arising that you can't link to a risk, then there's probably a risk missing, because now it's happened and you could possibly have prevented it or had controls in place to respond more effectively. So that's an example of where if you're tracking incidents and risks, you should be trying to link them together wherever you can. As another example, for an audit, you would want to link the audit to particular risks, particular controls, particular assets, for example, certain sites, teams, or processes that are within the scope of that audit. And correlating all of the risk-related data helps you to get the most out of the quite significant effort that's going to be involved in operating your audit program, collecting your incident data, assessing your risks. So rather than all of those activities being separate and siloed. Now, on sort of decision support, if you like, we work with a lot of CISOs, and they tell us the same thing over and over again, and that is that ultimately security improvements which are going to reduce risk require investment. And that means that at some point there needs to be a conversation, a business case between the CISO and the CFO, the budget holder. That conversation to justify investment with a view to reduce risk can only be helped by using a tangible, risk-based, ROI-based case to present to the CFO. And this is really only available using a quantitative approach. Another example, though, of making better risk-informed decisions is in relation to vulnerability management and how you might prioritize patching. So we all know that with a lot of infrastructure that you're scanning, sometimes you simply can't patch everything because of the sheer volume of vulnerabilities. So through a risk-based approach, a lot of webinars I've been to, there's a lot of focus on threat intelligence. So which of our vulnerabilities are the ones that will be exploited, and that's a good indicator. But through a risk-based approach and maintaining the right linkages between your systems and devices that you're scanning and the data that is associated with those scan nodes, so knowing where your data is, then we can start to prioritize remediation based on the potential data at risk. This is a really valuable input to vulnerability management remediations. So you can use your risk-based approach to help prioritize your patching. The fourth step in our recommended 7 steps was to report in a way that business leaders understand. Actually, reporting is going to be the main topic of our next webinar, so we'll come back to this. I did want to say, though, that when you're operating a risk management system, you're going to be raising actions against risks, against controls that need improvement, against incidents, against vulnerabilities, all sorts of issues. So a lot of actions. And I think the best way to, or one of the good ways to show business leaders your progress in addressing and reducing risk is to be able to report on the status of those actions in a sort of structured way. And so as per requirements of NIST, there's a case here for what we call POAMs, plans of action and milestones. So on our platform, certainly you can have all your actions, you can create your milestones, link actions to milestones, and then you can report to business leaders on how you're doing at addressing those actions per milestone. That's a really useful way of pulling together the data. We all know that evidence is vital in the event of a breach, if only to show that you were doing everything you could to prevent it. But of course, evidence is also a fundamental requirement for compliance with standards such as ISO and NIST. And ultimately, every operational control must have some sort of identifiable evidence. So technical controls, clearly they would generate log files, which you could look at. Procedural controls should involve some sort of record that things happened, and physical control should be visibly evident that you can see they're working or not. And so you need to think about how you can evidence each control so that you can audit it, and what you can then inspect in your internal audits. And one of our customers that I visit occasionally has a slogan on the wall which I really like, and it says, people won't always do what you expect, they'll only do what you inspect. And I really like that, and it shows the emphasizes the importance of inspecting evidence is really key. Step 6 is about accountability, and obviously we know that information security risks are operational by nature, and what that means is that the controls which are going to mitigate them need to be operationally effective. So you need to measure controls to make sure they are. So hence, again, the linkage between the risks and the mitigating controls, because otherwise risks can creep up again. And if you've got managers accepting risks, so the accountable people saying, I've accepted that risk, but then the risk has subsequently increased because controls are no longer as strong as they were at the time of acceptance, then you need to know that. And certainly in our system, managers can be assigned to particular risk dashboards, and if previously accepted risks go up because of new weaknesses in controls, then they can be made to flag. I think that's a really important factor. And final step is the importance of continuous improvement, really. And this is, I like the term operationalization. We've got to operationalize what we're doing in risk management. We've got to focus on the key risks, assess those risks in a way that is most meaningful to senior management, hence the topic of quant, make sure the right controls are linked to them, the priority risks, and continue operating our program of internal audits to make sure that controls remain effective, and obviously continue operating the scanning and all the other technical mitigations that you would. And finally, keep all that moving with prioritized and scheduled actions linked to all the areas requiring attention. So thank you, Simon. That was my point on practical side of things.
Thanks very much, Richard. Okay, just a few more slides to bring things through to a conclusion. Just following on from what Richard was saying there, coming back to this point about continual risk management, things do change all the time. We might be within our risk tolerance today, tomorrow things could be completely different. So we do need to be reactive to change. And I've sort of summarized on this slide the key factors really that can change, that we want to monitor if we can. So status of threats and threat intelligence, the performance of controls, vulnerabilities that we're seeing, and then of course what's happening in practice with test results, incidents, issues, and audit findings. And then finally, actions that Richard mentioned to address risk don't reduce risk until they're implemented and complete and tested and shown to have reduced risk. So overdue actions that hang around for ages are leaving us at higher risk than would otherwise be the case. Now, some of this monitoring and update can be automated. So taking in metrics in relation to control performance, for example, vulnerabilities from scanning systems, incident and near misses. It is possible in some cases to automatically reflect that data in our risk profiles and monitor against tolerance and report and so on. So again, reporting will be diving down into in more detail in the third webinar. So quantification, we think, is the engine of the risk-based approach, but it's only part of the risk-based approach. So we wouldn't do quant for quant's sake, but as part of a holistic risk-based approach to cybersecurity, then quantification is a key part of that, and that's going to deliver the benefits of the risk-based approach. So it will allow us to focus and prioritize on risk reduction. It will align our cybersecurity programs with the board's targets for reducing risk. It's going to optimize our defenses around risk reduction, resilience, and cost, and it will protect our critical assets, and it should be at an overall lower cost as well, because we're focusing down on what's really important and we're not over controlling our less critical assets. That in turn, so the risk-based approach with quantification will allow us to achieve our security outcomes. I won't go through all of these, but I hope you can see, we went through these at the start, but I hope you could see that the quant risk-based approach is going to give us the information and the data on which to deliver these good security outcomes. And I think much more so than the maturity-based approach, and also the qualitative approach to assessing cyber risk. Final conclusions. We believe at Acuity a risk-based approach is essential to good cybersecurity outcomes. Risk quantification is a vital tool for the risk-based approach. We should aim for an agile, scalable, continuous risk management. It's quite possible to do that and to build something that will grow and could be extended out into your organizations and provide you with this continual visibility of your risk status and provide the tools for risk-based decision making, and then use the outputs so that we can really reduce enterprise risk, optimize cybersecurity investments, and provide operational resilience. There's a separate resource, a white paper, Cyber Risk Quantifying What Matters, which we've produced to support this webinar. It can be downloaded. I think it's from the resources tab on the portal, but we'll be sending it out anyway by email to everybody that's registered and attended. And also, there's further information. Please do contact us. You've got Richard and my contact details on the front slide. Really like to engage, discuss things further with you. If you'd like to see the quantitative risk-based approach in action, we can provide you with a demonstration on our Stream Cyber Risk platform. There are other white papers, webinars on the website, and please do follow us on social media as well, and we can engage there. Just to recap, the final webinar 2 weeks from today, same time, on Tuesday the 2nd of June. We'd love you to attend that one as well. If you've enjoyed today, please come along to that one. We'll be talking about risk and the board, and why convincing the board of your cyber risk approach is the most important thing that you do. Okay, so with that, we'll stop. Thank you very much. Conscious that we're at about time, but if there are any questions, then we'll stay on, and those of you that would like to stay for questions and answers, please do so. Just a final request: when you leave, could you please complete the survey? We'd very much appreciate your feedback. So perhaps Richard, would you like to just moderate any questions that we've received? Richard, can we hear you? Are you on mute? Hello?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Hi.
Yep, all right.
Richard.
So we got you can hear me? Can you hear me? No.
Yeah. Yes, I can hear you now. Sorry.
Okay,
Sorry.
good. Okay. So we have a couple of questions. So the first one, it says, "Hi Richard," it's very friendly. "You briefly hit on the challenge of vulnerability remediation and how to effectively prioritize remediation. How easily and quickly can quant risk analysis be used to inform the risk-based approach to remediation?" And I think this goes back to what we were saying about having all the data linked. So, you know, we can pull data from common vulnerability scanning tools like Nessus and Qualys and Rapid7. So we've got the vulnerabilities coming in. We know which devices and assets they are affecting, and because of all the other linkages, we also know which data those devices are supporting, and we know which risks we have to the systems with that data on. So all the data is there to allow you to look up the sort of worst case impacts from the devices that have the vulnerabilities. So it's really just a question of deciding how you want to link those items together within the system, and then you can have a priority-based report on that. So that's exactly what I was referring to, and we can, whoever it was that asked, we'd be happy to show you that offline. Don't want to say who it was. So another question we've got here was, if we've always assessed risks qualitatively, it seems quite a leap to change to a completely different way of working. How practical is this? Good question. I'd say generally we wouldn't recommend you know, a sudden wholesale change to your methodology. And in fact, almost all of our customers have been assessing risks qualitatively for a long time. So what we would recommend is more of a gradual transition. So you might want to assess some of your key risks qualitatively and quantitatively to show management the difference and what additional benefit they get from doing it, and gradually ease them into it. And that's why we support what we call a mixed mode of assessment. So on a register per register basis, or even risk per risk, you can assess them one way or the other or both, just to gradually experiment and become comfortable with the change. So that's what we'd recommend. I think there's probably time for one more question. It says, "It seems that qualitative and quantitative risk assessments both require you to look at potential impact and probability, just in slightly different ways." Yeah. So in practice, is one assessment harder to do than the other? Would you like to take that one, Simon?
Sure. I mean, they're different, obviously, as we've seen. There are sort of two data points that we look to capture on our qualitative assessment: heat map type approach, which is usually a a very low to very high impact and likelihood, which is easy and understandable to assess and is used quite widely for enterprise risks. It's very difficult to then, I believe, make risk-based decisions on those, although you can communicate, and obviously Richard talked about triage using heat maps and so on. So they're easy to assess and they're easy to communicate at a very high level, very difficult to aggregate how many ambers make a red, for example, and is one red actually more important than another red to address. It becomes very difficult, and I've seen lots of arguments at that stage in meetings around the qualitative approach. The quantitative approach, we talked about the 4 data points there, so it can be simplified down. Having said that, it's new, it's a bit different. We are seeing people starting to adopt it. It requires a slightly different way to plan it. You might involve perhaps a few more people in that assessment than you would do for a simple qualitative assessment. So you might go to the business owner and talk about the potential for lost business, but you might also want to factor in potentially notification cost, detection and escalation costs that we looked at earlier, and perhaps there you'd want to talk to a subject matter expert or somebody that can give you that sort of input. I think with Quant, again, as Richard was saying, we can monitor as we go, so we can make an assessment, we can see what's happening in practice, we can refine our quantitative assessment as we go. So it's a little bit of a journey. I would say that Quant, we're trying to simplify with these 4 data points, and I really think it's worth the additional little bit of effort to put into the quantitative assessment, purely because of the outputs that you've seen that we can derive from that.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so I think we don't want to run over too much. So any other questions that might come in, we'll get back to people individually after the webinar.
Okay. Well, I think that leaves us then just to say thank you very much to everybody for attending. Very much hope to see you again in a couple of weeks' time.